Tell me, mortal, have you ever heard about Black Widow killers? I know that's an odd question to ask as we walk the Corpseroad today, but I was reminded recently of a soul I escorted along this road quite some time ago. To her it would have looked like a dirt road in a forest, unlike the highway you see before you, but I shan't bore you with otherworldly architectural manipulation. Back on topic, a Black Widow killer is a female of your species that tends to murder her lovers for financial gain. I suppose it sounds better than praying mantis killers, as they're known for biting their mates' heads off. She was quite an atrocious woman, frankly, but I found her story fascinating. Let me tell you of Belle Gunness and her farm of death. Belle was born Bernhild Paulsdatter Storset in Selbu, Norway, on the 11th of November, 1859. The daughter of Paul Pedersen Storset, a farmer of modest living or a broke bitch, depending on how polite you'd like to be about his financial situation, Bernhild clearly came into the world into one of the shittiest spawn points she could have picked. Her childhood was typical of the peasant children of the time, toiling on the farm, doing manual labor, watching over the livestock and picking up kindling sticks. She was seen doing this so often that the neighbors began calling her Snuk Vispala, roughly meaning Paul's twig daughter. It might not sound like that much of an insult, but imagine your neighbor calling you Bob's dog shit son or daughter every time you had to clean up after the family pet. It may start to grind on your nerves after a while. Opinions on Bernhild were mixed in Selbu. As a teenager, her pastor, Agaton Hanstein, thought she was more knowledgeable in her religious studies than most church girls. Her employer, a dairy farmer named Rode, thought she was an exemplary worker and didn't cause him any problems. The local newspaper, Silbyggen, on the other hand, had this to say: "She is remembered by many as a very bad human being, capricious and extremely malicious. She had unpretty habits, was always in the mood for dirty tricks, talked little and was a liar already as a child. As a grown-up, she was still little respected and was the scum of society. If I had to give my opinion, our dear Bernhild could have been a bit two-faced. Perhaps she played the proper citizen in front of authority figures and then got proper naughty amongst the commoners. Hell, there's even a story of her becoming pregnant at 17 by the son of some rich twat, and instead of him stepping up to marry her and care for it, he chose option 2 and beat her until she miscarried. Apparently after this occurred, the prick died of an intestinal ailment, which some suspected may have been arsenic poisoning. However, there isn't any documentation that any of that occurred. By the time the newspaper called her a massive piece of shit, Bernhild had been away from Selbu for years, and the incidents for which she's infamous had already happened. So of course they wouldn't have the most remarkable things to say about her after hearing about the nonsense she got on with in America. No one has substantial knowledge about Bernhild's early days, so let's get on with it. At some point, Bernhild decided that smelling like cow shit and living in Selbu with her broke-ass family just wasn't gangster enough, and decided to take her chances in the land of the free, the United States of America. Her sister, Olena, who had taken on a more American name of Nellie, had made her way out to Chicago years earlier and invited Bernhild to live with her and her husband, John Larson. Upon arrival, Bernhild changed her name to Bella Peterson and started doing laundry, sewing, and cleaning for work. But you see, Belle didn't come to America to do the same bullshit she could have done in Norway. Instead, Belle wanted the good life. So in 1884, she married Mads Ditlev Anton Sorensen. It said he was a nice guy, but Bella only stayed with him because he had a nice house. But of course, with an attitude like that, you know they only had sex once per year, and he only had 2 minutes to do it before she cast him back into the basement, only to be released to work. For some reason, Bella couldn't have babies, either due to fertility issues or because she just didn't want to bang her husband. We don't know, but in 1891 she managed to acquire a baby girl named Jenny Olsen. How do you just acquire a baby, you say? Well, apparently Bella and Mads were friends with a couple called the Olsens, and for some reason 8 months after Jenny's birth, the mother was dying. On her deathbed, she said the following to Bella.
"Bella, you've always been a good friend to me. You never snitched on me when I was making out with those Italian guys at the bar, and your peanut butter sandwiches are the shit. Now, as you know, my husband is one sorry son of a bitch that never bought me nice things like silk dresses and diamond-encrusted dildos. I can't have my daughter being taught dumb shit like budgeting and being responsible with her finances. It's lame, Belle. It's just fucking lame. Just find a man with cash and bleed him dry. This is the way. Here, take my baby, Jenny. Care for her as your own. Swear it to me. Show her the way of the gold digger. Love is fleeting. Prada is forever, or it will be in 1913 when the company is founded. I'm a time traveller, by the way. Okay, I'm going to die now. Bleh!
Now, strangely, Anton Olsen seemed fine with this arrangement. I've no fucking idea why, and can only conjecture that he just assumed Bella would be more like a super babysitter, while he got to go hang out in town and look for a new woman. But when he remarried and returned for his daughter, Bella took him to court to keep custody of Jenny and somehow won. Bizarre as all hell, but she did. Checking house, husband and kid off her checklist, Bella decided to shoot her shot at being a business owner in 1894. Mads and Bella managed to save enough money to buy a small candy store in a commercial district of Chicago. Of course, the store sold tobacco and cigars too, but that's candy to some people. This is when Bella's story starts to get a little odd. Despite their best efforts, the candy shop idea was a flop. The place was losing money by the day, and it would only be a matter of time before they were completely broke. It's a pity, but it's not unusual. Businesses and dreams fail more often than they succeed. It is what it is, after all. But then something happened, something tragic, or as I believe, rather convenient given the timing. As if cursed by the gods, the beleaguered little candy shop, barely in existence for a year, somehow spontaneously combusted and was set ablaze. Belle, running out of the flames with Jenny like a fat Forrest Gump, screamed for assistance with the fire to save what she could. But unfortunately, by the time the flames were extinguished, the interior was destroyed. So Belle was like, "Yo, one of those kerosene lamps totally just blew up on its own and burnt the place down. Weird, huh? Oh well, Deus vult, God wills it. Am I right, fellas?" The insurance investigators thought she was completely full of shit, as they didn't see any glass or broken lamps in the store as they tried to piece together what actually happened. They thought arson had occurred, but I guess the company didn't have enough evidence to prove it, or had better things to do because they opted to pay the Sorensens instead. Make a mental note of this interaction with insurance companies. It will come up again under far dire circumstances. Having gotten a fat payout, the Sorensen moved into a 3-story house in a fancier part of town, and between 1896 to 1898, they managed to acquire 4 more kids: Axel, Lucy, Caroline, and Myrtle. It's unlikely that she had the 4 kids naturally, unless her pussy somehow became a literal fertile crescent in her late 30s, wherein even a raindrop touching her vagina could produce human spawn. What's likely is that she found some kids no one wanted and took them in. That sounds awfully sweet of her, except for the 4 kids she took in. 2 of them just dropped dead shortly afterward. Little Caroline checked out of life at 5 months old of acute inflammation of the bowels, along with Axel at 3 months with water in the brains or hydrocephalus. Of course, infant mortality was pretty high back then, so no one really questioned their death, but it's a bit odd that 2 kids under her care shuffle off to the Corpseroad so close to each other. More tragedy struck the Sorensens in April of 1900 when a fire broke out in their home, allegedly caused by a defective heating apparatus. While the building was saved, the Sorensens lost all their household goods in the flames. Fortunately, it was all insured, and they received another fat paycheck. Do you see a pattern starting to form? If you don't, what comes next should make you go, Around this time, Mads had a life insurance policy on himself for $2,000 that was to expire on the 30th of July 1900. He'd decided to upgrade to a $3,000 policy that would take effect the day it expired. On that very expiration day, Bella called Dr. J.C. Miller to the Sorensen home along with Charles E. Jones, the family physician. When they arrived, they were met with the sight of a dead Mads Sorensen lying on his bed. Miller, looking at Bella with a "what the fuck" look on his face, waited for her to tell him what happened. She explained that Mads had been afflicted with a nasty cold and complained of a terrible headache. She gave him a dose of quinine powder to help him, which I find odd as quinine was used against malaria, but a side effect can be headaches. And he already has a bloody headache. I'm not a doctor though, so what the fuck do I know, but still. And went downstairs to make dinner. When she came back, he was dead. Oopsie. Dr. Miller, thinking that maybe a pharmacist had accidentally given Bella morphine instead of quinine, asked to see the paper that contained the medicinal powder. But unfortunately, Bella had already thrown it away, and seeing as both doctors were too fancy to dig through her trash or tell her to go get it anyway, they decided that Mads must have died from a cerebral hemorrhage and left to go snort cocaine out of a hooker's asshole. Bella, the sole beneficiary of Mads's life insurance policies, was paid $2,000 from his old policy and $3,000 from the new one. Gee, what a convenient time to die, am I right? If only we all could be such great spouses as to die at the moment most advantageous for our loved ones. If he died a day earlier, Bella would have only received $2,000, and a day later, just the $3,000. Instead, Bella was now bawling out with $5,000, $150,000 or more in today's money, from the man she only stayed with because he had a nice house. Even Bella's sister Nellie thought Mads's death was suspicious as hell and stated that she felt dread while attending the funeral, though she didn't know why. Wealthier, single and ready to mingle, Bella decided that it was time to move away from the loud and degenerate city life and settle down on a quiet farmstead of her own. In November 1901, she sold her house in Chicago, packed up her 3 kids, and rolled out to LaPorte, Indiana, where the locals would come to address her as Belle. It didn't take long for Belle to find another husband. A former boarder of hers, Belle Gunness, was recently widowed when his wife died during childbirth to their second daughter. Peter was known for being quite the handsome man, a Viking stud. This is why people were a bit confused when he and Belle married in 1902. Look, I have yet to mention it, but Belle was not the prettiest girl. In her younger years, people would say her face reminded them of an angry bullfrog. But now she's in her early 40s and didn't win the genetic lottery for aging well. One of her contemporaries described her as a fat, heavy-featured woman with big head covered with a mop of mud-colored hair, small eyes, huge hands and arms, and a gross body supported by feet grotesquely small. I'm sure you've caught on that I'm prone to hyperbole, but I added nothing to that statement. It's a direct quote. Bitch was fugly as fuck, but she had money and a 48-acre farmstead, so Peter likely cast her looks aside for the prospect of a good home for his daughters. This makes it all the more saddening that his 7-month-old daughter died 5 days after the wedding due to edema of the lungs. So that's the 3rd kid that's died around Belle, and not an eyebrow raised. Things that make you go, Losing a daughter is a pain that no father should ever have to endure. And Peter didn't have to for too long because he was found dead on the kitchen floor 8 months later. On the 16th of December 1902 at 0300 hours, Belle sent Jenny to fetch her neighbours, the Nicholsons, and when they arrived they found a hysterical Belle laying on the tiers in the most incredible acting role of her life, and her husband laying on his nose and bleeding all over the floor. Swan Nicholson, the father, sent his son Albert into town to get the doctor, and Albert, clearly an intelligent lad, saw Peter was way beyond a doctor and returned with the county coroner, Dr. Beau Bowell. Dr. Bowell proceeded to examine Peter and immediately noticed that he was dead. The problem was that the body had already grown stiff, meaning rigor mortis had set in. If you don't know, rigor mortis shows up approximately 2 hours after you die and completes in about 8 hours. However, it can last up to 24 hours before it ends. This is important because Belle claimed that this just happened, which Bowell immediately knew was bullshit, as Peter's whole body was stiffer than my dick on 5 Viagras walking the red light district in Amsterdam. Belle's story about the incident was fishy as well. She claimed Peter came down to the kitchen to get a pair of shoes he kept near the stove. As he bent over to grab them, somehow and someway, a meat grinder on the shelf motivated itself to fall over and bash him in the back of his head, along with a bowl of hot brine that fell on his neck and scalded him. Apparently, like the Viking he was, he decided to just take a nap on the couch to shake off his injury. Belle went back to bed upstairs, but when she returned a few hours later, she found him dead on the floor. Swan Nicholson didn't have much to say about her story, but Albert Nicholson and Dr. Bowell both looked at each other, raised an eyebrow, and let out a collective, yeah, sure, lady. They weren't buying it, but Bowell decided to wait for an autopsy before investigating further. What Bowell found during the autopsy is as follows. No evidence of scalds or burns on the entire body. Peter's nose was lacerated and broken, showing evidence of severe blows or falling upon a blunt article. A laceration through the scalp and external layer of the skull, about an inch long, situated just above and to the left of the occipital protuberance. Upon removing the pericranium, there showed a fracture and depression of the inner plate of the skull at a point corresponding to the external laceration. There was also marked intracranial hemorrhage. Death was due to shock and pressure caused by a fracture and said hemorrhage. Truly believing Belle's story was a lie and thinking he had a murder on his hands, he conducted an inquest of Belle, her 12-year-old foster daughter Jenny, and the Nicholson family on the 18th of December 1902. I won't go into the whole thing here, but while Bowell was suspicious of Belle, I reckon he didn't have enough evidence to really go after her. So, his official report basically stated Belle's story as what happened and left it at that. Did the town of LaPorte or anyone really buy that story? Fuck no, they didn't. Neither did Peter Gunness's brother, Gust, who believed she was involved not only in his brother's death, but the death of his 7-month-old daughter. Gust also knew Peter had taken out a $2,500 life insurance policy that was to be paid to his 5-year-old daughter, Swanhild, as the beneficiary. Doubting that money made it to Swanhild, Gust went to Belle's farmstead and confronted her about it. Belle claimed that Peter changed his mind and turned the life insurance policy into stock at a mining company instead, in the hopes that Swanhild would be a rich girl one day. When Gust wanted to see the receipts, Belle stated she didn't have them. Not liking the look in Belle's eyes, Gust hung around the farm for a few days before snatching Swanhild up while Belle was sleeping and getting the hell out of there. Belle was one child short now, but $2,500 richer, so she probably didn't give a shit, as Swanhild would have conveniently gotten sick and died at some point anyway. Belle got over the trauma of losing another husband very quickly and started putting ads in the newspaper for help running the farm. Among the first to respond was a 30-year-old Norwegian immigrant named Olaf Lindboe. He arrived on the farm with everything he owned and $600 in his pocket. He and Belle became close relatively quickly, to the point that neighbors thought she found a new lover. He even wrote a letter to his day in Norway, thinking he'd found a proper woman and that he may get married soon. So, it's odd that not long after that letter, Belle told one of her neighbors, Chris Christopherson, that Olaf just up and left the farm one day to go buy land in St. Louis, never to return. Swan Nicholson, whom Olaf had become friends with, claimed Belle told him Olaf decided to head back to Norway to see the crowning of the new king. When months went by without hearing from his son, Olaf's dad wrote to Belle inquiring about his location. She replied, stating that he went west and took up a homestead someplace. Bloody hell, Belle can't even keep her lies straight. How was she not caught sooner? I don't understand. Anyway, a few months after Olaf's disappearance, around April 1905, Henry Gerholt showed up to take his place, a big trunk of belongings at his side and ready to work. The same story played out. He worked, was friendly with Belle, and all seemed well. In August 1905, Belle showed up at the Christopherson home asking if he could help her stack oats because Gerholt had suddenly quit. Chris, confused as hell on why he would do that, said, "Did he just leave you at such a time when he had just cut the oats?" Belle stated, "He said he was sick and couldn't do the work." He left for Chicago with only a satchel and some clothes. His trunk and most of his clothes were still in Belle's house, along with his heavy fur coat. Chris would see Belle wearing the fur coat later in the winter and ask if Gerholt ever wrote her about getting his coat and having it sent to him, seeing as Chicago is fucking cold as shit in winter. Belle just said, "Nope," and continued to strut around the farm, looking like Baloo from the Jungle Book. At some point, Belle grew tired of just hiring farmhands who inexplicably go missing after a few months and decided it was time to step it up a notch. Her new newspaper ad read as such: "Wanted, a woman who owns a beautifully located and valuable farm in first-class condition, wants a good and reliable man as a partner in the same. Some little cash is required and will be furnished first-class security." Belle basically laid it plain and said if a man with the right amount of cash is out there, she's got a house and some tits for him to lay his head on. To the lonely but affluent men out there, this sounded like a dream. Of course, you and I know something isn't right on that farm. So let's cut to the chase and run down the names of the suitors that ultimately go missing upon arrival at Belle's farm. George Berry, or Tuscola, Illinois, arrived with $1,500, expecting marriage. A few weeks later, Christian Kilkvan of Dover, Wisconsin, arrived with $2,000, expecting marriage. Emil Tell of Osage, Kansas, quit his job and showed up at Belle's house with $2,000 and a hard dick in hand, ready to mingle. Ola Budsberg, a widower, sold his farm to his kids and showed up with $1,000. John Moe, yes, that's his real name, showed up with $1,000 and dreams of having ugly-ass Belle's big old titties in his mouth. There were many more men that would come from all around to stay to see Belle. Strangely, they wouldn't stay long, but none of the neighbors would see them leave, and they always left their supplies and trunks. Belle had a room in her house full of men's clothes and trunks. Around the summer of 1906, she hired William Brogiski to dig holes in her hog pen for her. Rubbish pits were allegedly their purpose, but Williams noted that she was very specific on the size of the holes, 6 feet long, 3 feet wide, and 4 feet deep. He never saw what went into those holes. Also of note, Jenny, Belle's foster daughter, who was now a pretty young lady of 16 years, was said to be preparing to go to college in Los Angeles, California, and that her mother would have one of the professors there come out to escort her there. A farmhand, Emil Greening, was quite friendly with Jenny and wanted to bid her goodbye on the day the professor was said to arrive. That day was just before Christmas, but to Greening's disappointment, Belle said Jenny had left earlier in the morning. However, no one working there nor the neighbors ever saw a professor come pick her up, and no one saw her leave. Emil, suspecting something was amiss, quit his job there. Ray Lamphere, a skilled worker but a drunkard, was hired as his replacement. At some point, Belle and Ray became fuck buddies, but don't worry, I won't describe the sexual encounters of skinny little Ray tapping 280-pound Belle from the back. I'll not have any vomiting this day, in spite of how much it amuses me. Now, Belle slept around with many of her employees just as a matter of course, so Ray, despite what he may have thought, was just another booty call. However, he will play a role in events to come, so make a note of him. The mystery of the disappearing suitors of Belle Gunness continued until she finally made the wrong man disappear, Andrew Helgelien. While he was like many of the other men in regard to what he expected to gain from Belle, Andrew didn't carry all his money around in his pocket like a moron. This, for some reason, chagrined Belle, as when he went to the bank to redeem his certificates of deposit for $28.39, they were told there would be a delay for nearly a week as the money cleared. Once it did, Belle insisted that he take all the money from the bank in cash. When the bank employee jokingly asked what he meant to do with all that money, Belle told him to mind his damn business and promptly led Andrew from the bank. No one saw Andrew alive again after that. Fortunately, Andrew told his brother Aisley that he was going on a trip and that he'd be back home within a week's time. He didn't tell him where he was going, as Belle told Andrew that she wanted it to be a romantic secret kept to themselves. Yes, I know that sounds stupid, but let's be honest. Love makes you do stupid things. When 10 days went by with no word from his brother, Aisler, and some of Andrew's farmhands became worried and looked through his cabin for an idea of where he went. What they found was a buttload of letters from one person, Belle Gunness of LaPorte. Aisley initially wrote a letter to Gunness, asking for the whereabouts of his brother, to which she replied with her standard, "How the fuck should I know" routine. Aisley didn't buy her initial response and sent more letters asking about his status. She started to claim that Andrew sent her a letter after he decided to go to Chicago to look for one of his other brothers. She stated she didn't have this letter, however, because Ray Lamphere, her now former farmhand, had become an angry ex-lover who had gone insane and took the letter in a fit of jealousy. You see, when Andrew arrived, Ray saw how much of a stunning Chad this guy was, and was a bit perturbed when Belle kicked him out of the house and told him to sleep in the barn, while Andrew got the guest room where he'd previously been sleeping. Over the course of the next few months, Lamphere would be arrested multiple times for harassment and trespass on account of Belle. A few of them may have been legitimate, but Belle also owed the man back pay and had his stuff on her property that she wouldn't give to him. Admittedly, the law enforcement in this area has been a shit show this entire time, and that worked out in Belle's favor. Nellie Larson, Belle's sister, arrived in Laporte upon hearing about the incident. Likewise, Asle Helgelian started to head to Laporte as well, and lastly, a Mrs. Orlander, apparently Jenny Olsen's older sister, arrived to find out if Jenny was also consumed in the fire, as she was expected to return to Laporte around that time. Larson and Orlander found nothing but confusion in Belle's will. Orlander's issue was, if Jenny was alive and at college, why wouldn't Belle put her in the will? Larson was taken aback by the fact that she left all of the estates to an orphanage when she had living relatives that could use the money. Aisley didn't give a fuck about any of that and just wanted to see what this fat bitch did with his brother. Aisley went to the Gunness farmstead and began looking around the property with the assistance of Joe Maxon, who was still looking for Belle's missing head. After looking for quite some time, Asle was at a loss and was on the verge of giving up when he asked Maxon if he knew of any holes that had been dug there around springtime. Maxon remembered the fenced-off hog lot and took Asle there. They didn't dig long before a putrid scent emerged. Maxon initially thought it was the smell of trash, but the smell was far worse than mere waste. Around 4 feet down, their shovels hit something hard covered in a sack, and in the tear caused by the shovel they could see a human neck. Besides, the sack was a severed human arm, and on top of the sack was likely Maxon's dinner, because I'm sure he blew his stomach contents seeing all of that. Maxon rode into town to get the authorities, while Asle and another man, Hudson, continued to dig at the site. Sheriff Smutzer and a coroner, Charles S. Mack, arrived and aided in bringing the body parts to the surface. Mack's words about the corpse are as follows. The head was separate from the torso, as was each arm from the shoulder down, and each leg from about 3 inches above the knee down, and to the further fact that putrefaction had set in. The face was a thing of horror, sunken holes for eyes, a leering gash for a mouth, a zigzag crack running from the top of the skull to the forehead. The victim struggled against his attacker, as his wristed showed 2 deep defensive wounds from a bladed weapon. The tips of the fingers of his right hand had been chopped off. Gripped in one hand was a clump of short brown hair, likely torn from the head of his attacker. Asle recognized the face despite the decomposition. It was Andrew, cast aside like trash in Belle's hog pen. 2 more men, a woman and a female adolescent, were found in the hog pen. All were dismembered into 6 pieces. Most were in such a state of decomposition that they were unidentifiable. But the female adolescent retained much of her long blonde hair and was able to be identified by locals as the body of Jenny Olsen. She never left the farm, and her remains had been found on her 18th birthday, the 5th of May 1908. However, at one of his trials at which she stood witness, Lamphere's defense lawyer would attempt to attack her credibility and say the things we are all thinking hearing this tale. He proceeded to bring up the sudden death of Peter Gunness, her collection of his life insurance, how a meat grinder magically fell on his head, and how no one bothered to check to see if Mads Sorensen may have been poisoned, and when was her foster daughter, Jenny Olsen, supposed to return to Laporte. This led to multiple objections in the courtroom. Lamphere lost the trial and had to pay a fine, but Gunness was clearly flustered, and with Asle Helgelian stating that he was coming out to Laporte to look for his brother, we can wager Belle was getting a little worried that her farm might come under scrutiny. As if setting up an exit plan, she would tell people she was worried Lamphere would burn her home down and kill her and her children. On the 27th of April 1908, Belle went into town to make out her last will and testament, leaving all her property to her children, Myrtle, Lucy and Philip. Yes, somewhere along the way she came across a baby boy. No one really knows how, just like they don't know how she got the other kids, so just accept it. And in the case of all 3 children dying, the property would go to the Norwegian Children's Home of Chicago. I guess she forgot about Jenny off in college. She placed the will in a safe deposit box and made a deposit of $730. She then went to the local general store and purchased groceries along with 2 gallons of kerosene. She saw Lamphere in the store, but no words were exchanged, and Lamphere merely watched her ride away on her buggy. A farmhand, Joe Maxon, recalled having a big meal with Belle and her family that night, and last seeing Belle playing with her children around 20-30 hours. He didn't see anything amiss about the evening, and went to bed. He awoke the next morning to his room full of smoke. He looked out of his window and saw the house covered in flame. He called out to the family, but could barely speak due to the smoke. Taking the back stairs, he escaped the house and attempted to re-enter the home through the front door with an axe when the roof right above his room collapsed. There was no sign of Belle or the children, just smoke and flame. With the intervention of neighbors and the volunteer fire department, the flames were extinguished. The local sheriff, Smutzer, immediately suspected Ray Lamphere as the cause of the fire, but proceeded to aid in the search for Belle and the children from the debris. In the afternoon, bodies were discovered in the southeast corner of the cellar. Blackened from the flames, and with varying levels of dismemberment, Gunness's children were identified fairly quickly, lying next to what appeared to be their mother. I say appeared because the adult female corpse was an unrecognizable mass, with the bones protruding through the naked flesh. Also, it didn't have a head. Someone surmised that the flames must have decapitated her, but the skull was nowhere to be found. The 4 bodies were collected and taken to the morgue. Ray Lamphere was picked up by Deputy Leroy Marr at John Wheatbrook's farm, where he was working that morning. Before Marr said anything about the fire, Ray said, "Did those 3 children and the woman get out of the building?" When asked how he knew about the fire, Ray stated that he saw smoke coming from the windows as he walked past the farm to get to work. When asked why he didn't say anything to anyone, Ray replied, "I didn't think it was any of my business." During interrogation, Lamphere stated that he felt people would blame him for the fire if he had said something earlier. Also, his alibi was that he was making sweet love to a 70-year-old black woman named Elizabeth Smith all night and couldn't have done it. While Miss Smith didn't admit to them banging her old bones all night, she did state that he indeed sought lodging in her home, backing his initial story. The sheriff tried his hardest to get a confession out of Lamphere, but to no avail. Ray pleaded not guilty and was held without bond, charged with arson and murder. LaPorte authorities pieced together what I'm sure you've already surmised. Belle Gunness lured single men of affluence out to her homestead in order to take all of their money and subsequently murder them. She would then either poison them or intoxicate them enough that she could physically murder them with a weapon with ease and bury them in her yard. Easy fucking money for a day's work of humping them and then killing them. Belle's murder farm had been exposed, and there were even doubts that the headless body found in the cellar with her children was even hers. Measurements were taken of the body found in Belle's cellar, and even if they'd found the head, the height of the corpse would have been approximately 5 feet and 2 inches. Belle was 5 feet and 7 inches. The body's weight was 130 pounds. Belle was 280 pounds. The flesh will shrink in flame, but not that goddamn much. So, the belief that Belle had faked her death wasn't far-fetched. People had claimed to have seen Belle Gunness boarding and departing trains in Chicago, and many believed she was still alive and on the run. The problem with all this was that if the body in the cellar was not Belle, then Ray Lamphere was likely innocent, and they had a murderer on the loose that they were way behind on tracking down. On the other hand, they had no real way of knowing that the body in the cellar wasn't Belle either at the time, and a jilted ex-lover burning down her house was a viable story to prosecute, especially given Ray's goofy story of seeing a fire happening there and not reporting it. Circumstantial? Sure, but better than nothing. I'm going to let you in on a little-known secret. Cops are kind of lazy, and once they have someone they think did something in their jail, they are very reluctant to do anything else except pin the crime on that person to close a case and move on with their lives. Ray's lawyer, Wirt Warden, saw it differently from the police and had 2 theories. Belle knew Ray had dirt on her and was going to snitch. She also knew Asle Helgelien was going to come to town to force an investigation on her property. Knowing that she'd be fucked either way, she murdered her 3 kids, placed them in the cellar with the adult female corpse she had there, lit the building on fire and escaped. Or she did all of the above, except the adult female corpse is her, and she committed a murder-suicide out of fear of being caught. I'm not going to go into the details of Ray's trial as it was a shit show, so we'll just fast forward to the conclusion. Ray was somehow found guilty of the arson, but not of the murders of Belle and the children. He was sentenced to prison, but died shortly after of tuberculosis. It's not exactly clear why the jury convicted him for arson but not murder, but maybe they just figured someone had to be held responsible, and Belle wasn't around, so Ray was the next best thing. Let's be frank. I've no doubt Ray knew what was going on at Belle's farm. The man was found wearing articles of clothing and jewelry from previous victims. To what extent he was culpable, we'll never know. But what of Belle, you say? Ray is obviously the scapegoat of a police force too stupid to do its job properly and wants to get the national news press off their backs. Belle is the main attraction. At least 11 bodies in total were found on her estate, and who knows how many more people died by her hand, buried in unknown areas of Laporte and beyond. Unfortunately, you may never know what became of her on Earth. DNA taken from the corpse found in her cellar in 2008 was too old to be properly tested, so no one can be sure if that is her body or not. Sightings and reportings of people thought to be Belle came in years after she allegedly died. But I'll tell you something else, my friend. While humans may never piece together her mystery, I don't have to. I know exactly where she is, and I'll take you to meet her for a chat. It'll be a long ride down the Corpseroad to her current location, but we'll take my Lexus LC convertible and stop for ice cream along the way. By the way, you should grab some sunscreen from the convenience store. The realms of torment can be quite hot this time of year. Be sure to come prepared. Next time.